Hello, I'm Ted Williams, and thank you for joining me in the WYCC studios at Kennedy King College, one of the 7 city colleges of Chicago. Today, we will engage in a topic that is both timeless and relevant to the political climate we are seeing throughout the country: politics and protest in the age of Trump. Joining me are Dr. Khaldoun Suisse, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Olive Harvey College, and Dr. Amara Inya, an expert in public policy and former candidate for mayor of the city of Chicago. Thank you for joining us today. Let's start, you guys. I'm so excited about this conversation. Let's start with talking about this issue of protests in the NFL and patriotism. So as we know, there are players right now who are being threatened, if you will, by their employees, or by their employers, excuse me, for protesting at NFL games. Why is this issue of patriotism at games such a big deal right now?
Well, I think it's a big deal because football is America's pastime. It's one of the most popular sports in the country, and so it is also a platform to make political statements. People who watch football aren't necessarily looking for politics mixed in with the game. However, key players such as Colin Kaepernick have taken it upon themselves to use the platform to make a political statement. And in this case, he made a statement about police brutality, police misconduct, something that has been an issue in this country for decades. And as of the last 5 years or so, has really been placed front and center in the consciousness of the country. And so it has ultimately made people uncomfortable. And I think that's why this issue of free speech and patriotism has come into play.
Dr. Suisse?
The NFL is a privately owned organization, and the owners have the right to tell their employees or their football players what they can and cannot do on the field, which they have done in the past. And when they tell them they can't do something, to disobey that rule is to disobey your employer, is thus lose or have a chance of having your job forfeited. As an American citizen, you have a right to protest. The flag gives you that right. It even gives you the right to protest against the very flag that gives you the right to protest, which is the ironic paradox there. So there are people who died, and that flag symbolizes them. It symbolizes their blood. So when people do not respect that, others are rightly angered by that.
But I think the issue of the flag, I think we're conflating, and it has been conflated in the national discourse, this issue of respect for the flag and the right to protest. And so what started off as a protest against, again, police misconduct and brutality happening across the country, then became an issue of whether or not people are respecting the flag of the country, and by virtue of that, respecting the United States. And I think it took attention away from the original intent of the protest.
Now let me give you a little background on this. So the country is extremely divided on this issue. So about 48% of people say that the demonstrations are respectful, and that's fine, but when you get into issues of race and class, the numbers get very different. So 8 out of 10 Democrats say the protests are civil, 9 out of 10 Republicans say they're not. 3/4 of African Americans say that the protests are okay. 55% of white Americans say that they are not. Also, I think this is very important when you think about sort of why this exists. Prior to 2009, it wasn't necessarily even customary that players would come out. And then sort of the Department of Defense, really trying to encourage patriotism, spent between 2011 and 2014 $5.4 million to stage patriotic ceremonies at games, and the National Guard spent $6.7 million between 2013 and 2015. So we're putting these players in a situation that maybe people in the past did not have to live up to, and really forcing them for the whatever 3, 4, 5 minutes to show their patriotism. So Dr. Suisse, you are saying that when someone signs up for a job, they lose their rights to free speech?
Of course not. That would be absurd. On their own, speaking as a private citizen, Kaepernick can speak as he wishes, what he says, what he wants, to even put his foot in his mouth because a private citizen. But as a representative of the NFL, representative of his team, he's speaking for them when he does that. And if they're not on the same ballpark as he is, as the same team that he is, speaking from the same political platform, he's causing divisions that are unnecessary. Take, for example, Donald Trump, our president. When he speaks on his own as a private citizen, he can say what he wants. But now, as a representative of the United States, what he says has impact not only generationally, but all globally
Well,
as a president. So
okay.
your position is important. We can't forget that.
Okay, I would have to personally
Yeah.
disagree with the connection between the role that Donald Trump plays and the role that Colin Kaepernick plays in their weight, et
representative.
cetera.
Well, the
But
reality
go ahead.
is that the NFL teams, the owners have the option of determining how they want to crack down on his constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And so in the instance where they have not specifically said, you cannot exhibit this protest lest you are in violation of your contract, he has every right to continue to do that. They are the ones that have to decide whether they want to tamp down on his right to free speech or not, and what the political fallout would be if they said, well, you are not allowed to take a knee during the national anthem.
Which I think is really tragic and sad that this is even an issue right now, because Colin Kaepernick, if you remember, originally was sitting during the national anthem, got consultation from a war veteran who told him you should kneel. That kneeling is more respectful than sitting, and so you can still show your disagreement, but you're doing it in a more respectful way. And now the kneeling has become the sign of disrespect, which I just don't understand.
Well, it's aligned with the numbers that you had read off earlier about a certain percentage feeling that the protest was not civil. And to me, the question is, well, how are we defining what civil protest looks like? If taking a knee and kneeling during the national anthem is not civil, then what is civil?
That's a great question. That's an excellent question. I didn't mention, by the way, as you refer back to those numbers, that the gap is also an age gap as well. That older people are more offended by his actions, and younger people have less of an issue with it.
Well, the question is, protest is never designed to make people comfortable, and it's never designed to play to what people are comfortable with or what they deem acceptable. The very nature of protest, it is a disruptive mechanism to gather and to garner attention to a particular issue or set of issues. And so by its very nature, it is supposed to be disruptive. It is supposed to make you uncomfortable. And so the questions that we should be asking in this instance are not who's comfortable and who's not. It's what are we talking about? Are we talking about the issues that they set forth to have addressed by engaging in that form of protest?
That's an excellent question. I want to move to a little different topic in this conversation, because in the midst of all of this overt and obvious controversy that I think the president is really ginning up, if you will, there are a lot of policy actions that are happening that people have no idea about. For instance, the White House just appointed a pesticide lobbyist as the EPA deputy assistant. I mean, this is nuts if you think about it. The White House just put forth this piece of legislation that would block citizens from having the ability to sue the credit card industries collectively. If you look at, for instance, 18 states right now are suing the Department of Education basically because they are blocking the ability for people to erase the debt if they've gone to school and the school's been fraudulent and they want to sue or get their debt released. The Trump administration is blocking those efforts. So we're upset about tweets. But what's going on in policy? And I think we ought to be talking about that, particularly around economic issues, which I know that we've got some disagreement at the table about how we ought to be going. What do you think about what's happening in terms of policy, and what do you think?
Well, I think that the president serves as a convenient distraction to a lot of other things that are happening within the administration, policies that are very insidious from my view, but paying attention to what he's tweeting at 3 a.m. is what gathers headlines, and it's what gets attention. And so while we're all focused on his latest gaffe or his latest tweet, a lot of those things that are happening are being pushed through different channels in the administration. And so we're not following it because it's not in the headlines, it's not at the forefront. And so that's a very dangerous thing. I think whenever there is an agenda that needs to be carried out, one of the most effective tools is to distract people and to have people paying attention over here, whereas all of these things are happening over there. And I think that's what's happening within this administration.
Mm-hmm. Are you, in general, pleased with the direction of the administration in terms of policy? Particularly around, I'll speak to this, I didn't mention this as well, but the budget that just passed in the Senate has $1.5 billion in tax cuts that are paid for by debt and deficit spending. So I know that Dr. Sweets, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about this because I know that you tend to agree with some of the economic policies. Tell me what you think about what's going on coming out of the White House.
You see, from the Obama administration, coming from the Democratic perspective, it's coming from a different perspective than the Republican one, which looks at trying to engage people on a deeper level by helping, by reaching out, by giving out. While the Republican side says, yes, we will engage by helping them get more jobs, get more education. So these are different perspectives on that. How does that actually work? Well, the Democrats do it in one way and the Republicans do it in a different way. How the Republicans do it is seen from a perspective in psychology called cognitive bias. And cognitive biases are important in how we see economic policies. If I am for a position, I will minimize subliminally everything against that position that's against what I'm trying to push forward. I see it with students of mine doing their research papers. They will minimize or ignore evidence against their position, or and then exalt and exemplify positions that are for theirs. And that's normal, what people do. It's a natural process that we do. We just have to be aware of it. And when we see the Trump administration pushing down these policies, first I have to think, what is my perspective on economic entitlements and help for the people who are disenfranchised? How do I see that? Do I see that they're disenfranchised because of sociological situations beyond their control? Or do I see it because of sociological situations in their control? And some of these perspectives are important in how we actually look at the policies that are being passed down. And I think that helps us to see that when a policy does come down, how am I looking at it? From what perspective am I coming at from this issue?
I hear you, and you got to help me, okay? You're going to have to help me on this. Because I try to be a relatively nonpartisan kind of person. I cannot find any good in any of this, and you got to help me understand this issue of perspective. I mean, what is good about blocking people's ability to erase student loans from a fraudulent school? What is good about gutting the EPA? What is good about, I mean, you got to help me out with this.
There's definitely value to having that kind of perspective, which is a much more balanced approach to policy analysis. However, there are just certain tenets, especially when it comes to economic policy, that either work or that they don't. And so one of the things that came out of the budget talks with regard to this tax plan, and this notion that cutting taxes for large corporations leads to job creation, that is false. It has been proven to not work time and again, and yet we continue to see at every level of government, whether it's our local municipal, state, and now national, where a large part of the tax policy involves cutting taxes to large corporations. We've also, we're talking about wages and this notion of people not being on welfare or not getting entitlements, what we call entitlements. However, no one is looking at the fact that wages have been stagnant for decades. So the issue is not necessarily that more people need to get access to entitlements. The issue is that corporations and companies that employ people, everyone is underpaid. And so if you do not have that sort of additional income to spend into the economy, you're not going to see the kind of economic growth that can really move the country forward. However, the tax plan that's put forth by this administration, and it's been replicated in previous administrations, it follows the same failed economic tenets that we know do not work, and yet we keep pushing this forward as a national economic agenda.
Wait a minute, are you saying the policies put forward by the Obama administration did work? Those worked.
I'm saying, so
I mean, that's a general question.
It is a general question.
Specifically regarding economics.
Specifically regarding the first step that he took, which was around the stimulus package, which was absolutely necessary and absolutely worked because it prevented us from going from a recession to a deep depression. I believe in infrastructure investments as a way to create
our national
jobs.
debt keeps going up
But
and up and
deficit,
up.
But the debt and debt, see, that's also misleading. See, people align national debt and they think about it in terms of our personal debt, and that's actually a false equivalency. So the debt has actually been large under everyone's administration. What we need to be looking at is what is the economic viability of individuals, families, communities, states, in that order. If you're not seeing, if wages are stagnant year after year, that's a problem because it means our economy is not going to grow like it should. Under the Trump administration plan, it focuses more so on tax breaks for large corporations. They're talking about adding another class, which I actually think might be a good idea, adding another income class for tax purposes. But the whole philosophy is still falling along the lines of the trickle-down economic philosophy.
Well, Trump is talking about the simplification of the tax code and other complications that
Yes.
are just driving people nuts as they go through this, and provide jobs for the accountants out there left and right, of course. But the key is the trickle-down economics or Reagan economics. The only reason people push it is because it does work in one level. And that's why the Republican system has been pushing that on almost every administration. And then it flips as soon as the administration changes, right? It goes back to the other policy. Why do we do that? Again, it goes back to our preconceived positions on where we should be moving forward in our wealth and our economy for people. Where does that come from? Does it come from the top down, or does it come from the bottom up? And do we strengthen people from at the bottom level, at the core levels, or do we move down and bring it down to them? Which one is it? Are people personally responsible for what they're doing on a level, and there are some things out of their control, or is it the other way around, that most things are out of their control and they're not as responsible, and they need mother and father of patriarchal system of the government to step in and do it for them?
Well, I mean, I hear you, and but when you talk about debt, Amara just mentioned this. You know, it's not like Obama started the national debt. It's not like the national debt did not double under George Bush. It's not like we didn't have the Cold War and Reagan, all of his spending. And, you know, I really have a hard time when we talk about, we try to blame the Democrats for that, and we try to blame Democrats for people not having personal responsibility. Because if you think about it, you could make the argument, the federal government's the largest employer in America, right? And if you think about it, they're not employing and spending most of their money and resources on poor folks in communities that don't have anything. Most of their money is being spent on government contracts and that sort of thing, defense contracts, et cetera. So what about some personal responsibility for them?
And that's also an argument that I think is falsely attributed to Republicans, whereas there is this notion of personal responsibility is important on both sides. However, when we know that there are systems in place that give unfair advantages and disadvantage certain groups or individuals based upon either their income, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, et cetera, then it's much more difficult to make the personal responsibility argument. For example, there's research that outlined how for an African American who has an advanced degree of a PhD perhaps would still make less than their counterparts who have a bachelor's degree. Now we can say, did you take personal responsibility to get the education that you should have gotten? Well, yes, you went and got a PhD, but there are structures in place in society that make sure that that person, that individual, will have a lower income based upon those systems that are in place, not because they didn't take responsibility. And so government's responsibility is to create the environment in which every individual, by virtue of their existence, has the opportunity to actualize their full human potential. Government can play that role by creating the environments, because when they want to create the environments, they do. That's how we have the system of now where corporations are pretty much running our entire government, where corporations who have the wherewithal to hire high-priced attorneys to negotiate and navigate the complex tax code and get tax breaks, reducing revenues for the country because they're offshoring their income or hiding their income in other accounts. That's what the wealthy have been able to do because they have the wherewithal. Meanwhile, those who are at the bottom of the economic scale, who for all intents and purposes have been personally responsible, find the deck stacked against them because they don't have the money to influence the political climate.
So let me ask you this, because you guys we're talking a lot about inequality, which is I mean, you know, outside of racism is America's greatest sin, right? And maybe I don't know how you parse those two out. Maybe they're very inextricably linked together on this. But inequality and injustice is really the reason for the NFL protests that we were talking about in the beginning. And back to this issue of policy versus tweeting, right? That should be the name of this conversation, right? Policy versus tweeting. But back to that question, have these injustices gotten worse? And has this inequality moving in the wrong direction since, I would argue, and I don't want to just blame Trump, because I don't want to overly simplify politics. I understand we cannot do that. I mean, he's only been in office for 10 months, 3 weeks, 7 days, and 22 hours and 37 minutes. And I'm not counting though. But so are these issues getting worse? And what, I mean, this issue of inequality and justice, let's talk about that for a moment.
Okay, let's talk about it in the academic world. For example, there have been people on the Trump side or on the right side who have been uninvited from universities across the board. It's happened throughout the years. But now it's exemplified to the point there were massive protests coming in.
You said folks on the right.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
there are protests on the left, people on the left uninviting people on the right, or causing a stir on the issue of free speech on campus. This issue is major, not just campuses, but even in the political arena. People do not want to allow the other side to speak. Even when Trump came here to downtown, to Chicago to speak, there were protests. Even from my own students went to protest against him coming to speak. This is the United States of America. You're supposed to allow the other side to speak, and if he's wrong, let him put his own foot in his mouth. You don't have to put yours in there. We're not Iran, we're not Cuba. We're not supposed to shut down the other side. Matter of fact, when I gave talk, I've been 14 debates on campuses here at city colleges where I teach. 2 times those debates have been shut down by my progressive leftist friends who champion free speech. They're shutting it down. And of course, the topics are the fiery topics of homosexuality and evolution. They would not allow the other side to speak. They sent letters across the board, other than the point of asking for my resignation. This is an issue where, yes, if Trump is wrong, and in many cases he is, but he's also doing some good, which I could talk about a little bit. But if you're not going to allow the other side to speak because your emotional diapers are on, you need to take those off and recognize that other people need to speak, and you need to get offended by it. Otherwise, you have to remove the area of speech
Okay, but Dr.
from this
Smith,
country.
wouldn't you suggest, and I hear you on this, and I'm all for free speech as well, that there's a difference between people having different opinions on issues of evolution or something like that, and people who are inciting violence by their speech because they're neo-Nazis, or because they are arguing for white nationalism, or because they are promoting violence, which is basically what the president did when he came to Chicago, and he was arguing, you know, we should throw these people out and get them, and he made comments like, oh, let the Second Amendment people take care of Hillary Clinton, things like that. So he's inciting violence, and violence begets violence.
I wouldn't say he's inciting violence there. I think he's exaggerating hyperbolic statements such as about Islam and about, you know those are hyperbolic statements because they cannot be followed up in policy.
The First Amendment is not without caveats. I mean, the First Amendment does not protect speech that does incite violence.
That's
and
right.
On a number of occasions, I think the president, in my opinion, crossed the line, but for those who agree with him, maybe he towed the line. His comments about the Second Amendment, the implications that he made, I mean, those are very dangerous things. Now, I agree that people should be able to speak. I don't believe that the counter to speech that we don't like is to shut them down. But equally, they have the right to protest the speech or protest whatever's being said. But I actually don't agree that we should shut down people who have a difference of opinion. Now,
Even those who support Trump?
Even those who support Trump, because they have a right to express that they don't support Trump.
Absolutely.
Now, if the language that's being used, if Trump or his supporters or whomever is using language that is inciting violence or moving into that territory, then no, because that's a violation of the First. That's not in line with the spirit of the First Amendment.
I'll leave it unnamed. Major corporation here in Chicago, the CEO sent an email after Trump was elected a few days. Anyone here who voted for that man, you can resign right now. That email went and made it public. You could Google it, of course, you figure out who that was. That is a form of not only political discrimination, it's ideological discrimination.
Yes, but did they actually follow through? Because based on your argument a few minutes ago, it's just hyperbole. They're just talking.
If they follow through with it, then you have an issue.
And
Okay,
also,
right.
but also, it's a private company,
right?
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
right.
so that private company has the right to determine
Yes.
the criteria upon which people can be employed. Right?
I got to say this real quickly. There, in 10 days after the 2016 election, there were 900 reports of hate incidents across the country. There's been a 67% increase in hate crimes against Muslims in the last year in this country. We have to understand that this stuff is not without consequence. And yes, as the president, you cannot just say whatever you want to and think that it's not going to have a ripple effect throughout the country.
And around the world as well. Believe me, I, as a believer, as a Christian, as an American, I'm disturbed by some of the things coming out of the mouth of our commander-in-chief. You know, attacking the war record of one of our veterans, making fun of a disabled
reporter. I mean, you can go down a list. There's so many examples.
There are many things that disturb us at a deep level, especially the treatment of women.
Yeah.
But it's one of the other things you see from the other side, you're asking. I see these women protesting downtown, Women's Day, against Trump. Hold on a minute. Where were you when Clinton was doing what he was doing in the White House?
Okay, you know what? That'll be for the next show.
You're talking about the other side. You need to look at things from both sides in order to be fair.
Okay, you know, on that note, we have to stop. We're out of time, unfortunately. You got to bring up Clinton. Clinton, don't you? You know what I'm saying? I mean, come on, man. And I can't respond because we don't have time, but I will get you
Or
next
the
time.
FBI letting Hillary slide, you'll keep on.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I am Ted Williams here at WYCC Studios at Kennedy King College. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.